We often hear about no contact as the best way to heal after a breakup, as a way to reclaim your power, your peace, and your emotional space, and that's true. But what most people don't realize is that no contact doesn't just affect the person who was left behind. It affects the one who left too, especially the avoidant. See, avoidant individuals build walls not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much. They've learned somewhere along the way that closeness equals danger, that love equals pain, that connection means losing control. So when they start to feel someone getting too close, someone who truly sees them, they retreat. They say they need space. They tell themselves they're better off alone. But here's the thing, the moment you go no contact, they suddenly lose the very illusion of control they were clinging to. You disappear not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And for the first time, the avoidant has to sit with silence that they can't manage. They expected you to chase. They thought you'd send that one more text, that one more late night message saying, "I'm here if you change your mind." But you didn't, and that silence, that stillness, it's not just peace for you, it's a mirror for them. It reflects everything they've been running from. The avoidant starts to feel the absence they once created, and that's when the irony sets in. The very person who wanted distance now misses the connection they lost. But they can't reach out easily because that would mean confronting their fear of vulnerability, so they stay stuck, torn between longing and pride. You, on the other hand, begin to grow, to heal, to rediscover who you were before you started shrinking yourself to fit their comfort zone. No contact hurts avoidance more than you think because it removes their safety net, the idea that they can pull away and you'll always be there waiting. It forces them to face the truth that love doesn't wait forever, and that independence without emotional connection is just loneliness in disguise. So if you're sitting there wondering whether no contact even matters, wondering if they're out there unfazed, living their best life, trust me, they're not as fine as they pretend. Avoidants don't forget you easily. They just take longer to admit they miss you. And by the time they do, you've already built a life that doesn't need their validation anymore. That's your quiet victory, not in revenge, but in growth. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not chase, not explain, not fight, just let your silence speak. Avoidants often get misunderstood as cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable, but what most people don't realize is that their detachment isn't a lack of feeling. It's the result of feeling far too much. At some point in their life, they learned that love can hurt, that closeness can lead to pain, and that vulnerability comes with the risk of rejection. So instead of leaning in when things get real, they pull back. They create emotional walls to feel safe, to stay in control, and to avoid the overwhelming flood of emotions that intimacy brings to them. Love feels like a trap. They fear that if someone gets too close, they'll lose themselves or end up being hurt again. So they build distance, convincing themselves that being alone is easier than being disappointed. But underneath that self-protective armor is someone who deeply craves connection. They want to be understood, they want to be seen, and they want to love freely. But the moment that connection starts to feel too real, panic sets in. Their mind starts whispering, what if this person leaves? What if I get hurt? What if I can't be enough? Instead of facing those fears, they retreat into a shell of independence, masking fear as strength. They tell themselves they don't need anyone, that they're fine on their own, but deep down, that's a lie they use to stay safe. When they meet someone who loves them patiently, who tries to break through the walls, it becomes both comforting and terrifying. They enjoy the warmth but fear the dependency. They want to stay but fear the vulnerability that staying demands. So they keep people at arm's length, not because they don't care, but because caring too much feels like surrendering control. For them, attachment equals risk, and risk equals pain. It's not that they can't love, it's that they love in silence, behind defenses built from old wounds. Their avoidance is often misunderstood as arrogance or emotional indifference, but the truth is, it's often a trauma response. Maybe they grew up in an environment where emotional needs weren't met, where expressing feelings brought rejection or criticism. Maybe they had to learn early on that being self-reliant was the only way to survive. So now, as adults, they carry that lesson into relationships, believing that needing someone is a weakness. But the irony is that this very strategy, the thing meant to protect them, ends up isolating them. They want love, but their fear of getting hurt makes them push away the very people who could give it to them. When an avoidant starts to feel truly seen, they may even sabotage it unconsciously. They'll nitpick small flaws, withdraw suddenly, or create conflicts just to regain emotional distance. It's their way of testing if they still have control, if they can still pull away before it's too late. Yet deep inside, they're longing for someone to understand that the withdrawal isn't rejection. It's fear. Fear of being dependent, fear of being disappointed, fear of losing their sense of self. This emotional tug-of-war between wanting love and fearing it is what makes avoidance so complex. They crave intimacy, but only within the limits of what feels safe, which often means keeping love just out of reach. And while their behavior might seem confusing or hurtful, it's rooted in old emotional wounds that never fully healed. So when they build walls, it's not because they don't feel deeply, it's because they do. Their silence is not emptiness, it's a shield, and behind that shield is a heart that still aches for closeness, but doesn't yet know how to trust it. When you decide to go no contact with an avoidant, something powerful happens not just for you, but for them too. Avoidants thrive on a sense of control. They've learned to manage emotional connections by deciding when to engage and when to withdraw. It's how they protect themselves from the fear of being overwhelmed or hurt. They like knowing that they can keep you close enough to feel safe, yet distant enough to not feel vulnerable. But the moment you step away, when you stop reaching out, stop explaining, stop waiting, you take away that illusion of control. Suddenly, they're no longer the one dictating the pace of connection. The dynamic shifts, and that unsettles them more than they'll ever admit. At first, they might feel relief. Avoidants often convince themselves that distance is freedom, that silence means peace. They may even tell themselves they're fine, that they needed this space anyway, but as the days go by, the quiet starts to echo. The lack of your messages, your presence, your warmth, it starts to highlight what they've truly lost. And it's not just about missing you, it's about losing the emotional stability your consistency brought them. Your patience, your effort, your energy were things they counted on, even if they never acknowledged it. They might have taken it for granted, but once it's gone, that absence begins to sting. You see, for an avoidant, emotional control is everything. It's how they feel safe in relationships. They like knowing that if things get uncomfortable, they can pull away and you'll still be there when they're ready to return. No contact disrupts that pattern completely. It leaves them with no safe return point, no reassurance that you'll still be waiting. That's when the cracks begin to form in their emotional armor. The illusion that they can detach without consequence starts to crumble. They begin to feel an unfamiliar sense of loss, not because you punished them, but because your silence broke the cycle they relied on. No contact also forces them to face the emotions they've spent their lives avoiding. Avoidants are experts at distraction. They'll bury themselves in work, hobbies, or surface-level interactions to avoid feeling too deeply. But your absence leaves a void that can't easily be filled. There's no text to ignore, no tension to manage, no conversation to control. Just silence, and in that silence, emotions begin to surface: regret, longing, confusion, even guilt. Feelings they've kept buried now rise to the surface because there's nothing left to suppress them. What they don't realize at first is that this loss of control isn't a punishment, it's an awakening. It's the first time they're forced to confront how much power they gave fear in their relationships. They start to understand that real control doesn't come from keeping emotions at arm's length, but from facing them with honesty. And ironically, the one who walked away, the one who stopped trying, becomes the mirror that shows them this truth. Your silence holds up a reflection they can't escape. It makes them question their choices, their patterns, their idea of connection itself. So while it may seem like they don't care, the reality is that your absence speaks louder than any words ever could. The no-contact boundary strips away their illusion of emotional safety and replaces it with raw, uncomfortable truth. And that truth hurts, because it reveals that the control they thought they had was never real. It was just a way to avoid feeling the depth of what they were too afraid to lose. Silence has a way of revealing things words can never express. When you go no contact with an avoidant, that silence becomes a mirror, a reflection of everything they've been running from. Avoidants are masters of distraction. They keep their minds busy and their emotions locked away behind walls of logic and control. As long as you're still reaching out, as long as they know you're there, they can maintain the illusion that they haven't really lost anything. Your presence, even in small doses, allows them to stay comfortable in avoidance. But when the calls stop, when the texts don't come, and when there's nothing left to ignore, reality begins to sink in. For the first time, they are left alone with their own thoughts, with the silence they once thought they wanted. At first, they might tell themselves it's fine. They might say you're just giving them space, that they needed this distance. But as time passes, the silence starts to speak, and what it says is uncomfortable. It shows them the consequences of their emotional withdrawal. The same walls they built to protect themselves now become their prison. The calm they wanted turns into emptiness. The peace they imagined feels eerily like loneliness. Suddenly, they can no longer hide behind the excuses they once used to justify pulling away. Every unanswered message they never sent, every emotion they buried, starts echoing back at them through the quiet. For someone who avoids intimacy, silence is terrifying because it takes away their escape routes. There's no one left to project onto, no one to blame, no one to distract them from their own avoidance. The mirror of silence shows them the emotional cost of pushing away the people who cared. It forces them to see that the absence they created has become their own doing. And deep down, they start to feel the weight of it, not just the loss of the relationship, but the loss of safety that connection once gave them. They may not admit it out loud, but their mind starts to replay moments, your laughter, your kindness, your patience, and each memory becomes a small reminder of what they took for granted. This is where the irony begins. Avoidants crave independence and freedom, yet in your absence they start to realize that freedom without connection feels hollow. The silence makes them see that their emotional self-protection came with a heavy cost: isolation. They start to understand that control isn't the same as peace, and solitude isn't the same as safety. The silence doesn't punish them, it awakens them. It forces them to sit in discomfort, to feel the ache they've avoided, and to recognize that their defense mechanisms no longer serve them. Meanwhile, for you, the silence is healing. It's where your energy begins to return, where you rediscover your voice, and where your peace starts to grow. But for them, that same silence becomes confrontation. It holds up a mirror to their deepest fears: abandonment, inadequacy, and the loss of control. And because they've spent so long avoiding these feelings, facing them becomes overwhelming. They begin to see that the person who once offered comfort and understanding is no longer available to absorb their uncertainty. That's when the silence shifts from background noise to emotional truth. It shows them what connection truly meant and what it feels like to lose it. So while it may seem like you're doing nothing by staying silent, that nothing is actually everything. It's the mirror that reflects their emotional patterns, the one thing they can't manipulate or escape. And as they face that reflection, they begin to realize that the silence they once chose has become the very thing that teaches them what real loss feels like. No contact is more than just distance. It's a lesson that challenges the avoidant's deepest belief that love will always be there, waiting, no matter how many times they pull away. Avoidants often move through relationships with a quiet confidence that the other person will keep trying, keep understanding, and keep showing up. They assume love is unconditional in the sense that it endures no matter how much they retreat. But when you stop reaching out, when you let silence replace your effort, it teaches them something powerful. Love has boundaries. Affection isn't endless when it's unreciprocated. And emotional safety doesn't come from running away from vulnerability, but from facing it head on. For the avoidant, vulnerability feels like exposure, like stepping into the unknown without armor. They've learned to equate independence with strength and emotional openness with danger. When someone gets too close, it triggers their instinct to withdraw. It's not about wanting to hurt anyone, it's about wanting to feel safe, so they keep their distance, believing that real love means being self-sufficient and unbothered. But no contact flips that belief upside down. When you walk away without chasing, it sends a message they can't ignore. Love cannot exist in isolation. Connection requires participation. It requires both people to show up emotionally. Over time, the no-contact silence dismantles their idea of emotional security. They realize that love isn't something they can hold on to while staying detached. It's not a safety net that exists just because someone once cared for them. It's alive only when it's nurtured, and when it's not, it fades. That realization often comes as a shock because the avoidance defense mechanisms depend on believing they can disconnect without losing anything. They assume they can take space and return when it feels comfortable again. But your absence breaks that cycle. It teaches them that connection has an expiration date when one side keeps retreating. This understanding doesn't come easily. At first, they might rationalize it, tell themselves you were too emotional, too needy, too intense. But with time, that justification starts to crumble. They begin to see that what they once called needing space was really a way of avoiding depth. They start to feel the weight of that avoidance when there's no one left to bridge the gap. The love they thought would wait forever doesn't, and that realization hits harder than they expect. It challenges the belief system they've built around relationships that keeping emotions at a distance equals safety. Now, they see that safety without intimacy is just emptiness wearing a disguise. No contact becomes a silent teacher. It shows them that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the foundation of connection. The people who are brave enough to stay open, to communicate, to lean in when things get hard, those are the ones who build relationships that last. Avoidants begin to understand that real strength isn't in retreating, but in risking closeness. And as they sit in the silence they created, they start to grasp that love doesn't disappear out of punishment, it fades because neglect starves it. It's not that you stopped loving them, it's that you stopped feeding a connection that couldn't grow through fear. Through your silence, they learn what every avoidant fears the most, that love, once lost through avoidance, may not come back. And that lesson, though painful, is often the one that transforms them the most. It forces them to confront the truth that emotional safety doesn't come from building walls. It comes from the courage to let someone see you without them. There comes a point in your healing when silence stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like power. Choosing not to chase, not to explain, not to prove your worth to someone who withdrew from you is one of the most transformative decisions you can make. For so long, you might have been the one holding the emotional weight of the relationship, trying to keep the connection alive, softening your edges, overthinking every word just to make things work. When you finally decide to step back, to reclaim your peace, you begin a process that the avoidant never expected. They assumed you'd always be there, waiting with patience and understanding, but your quiet withdrawal shatters that illusion. It's not revenge, it's evolution. Your silence becomes a statement of self-respect. It says, I'm no longer available for half-hearted love. Avoidants are used to having emotional control in relationships. They pull back, and the other person leans in. It's a rhythm they know well, one that protects them from feeling vulnerable. But when you break that rhythm, when you no longer play your part, the balance shifts entirely. Suddenly, they're left without the reassurance they once took for granted. They start to feel the weight of your absence, not because you punished them, but because your energy is no longer feeding their comfort. You've stopped being their emotional safety net, and in doing so, you've reminded them that love isn't a guarantee. As you hold your silence, something within you begins to change. The space that once felt empty starts to fill with clarity. You begin to see that your worth was never meant to be negotiated through someone else's inconsistency. You realize that love doesn't require constant proving. It flourishes in mutual effort, mutual vulnerability, and mutual respect. The avoidant may have mistaken your kindness for permanence, believing you'd always understand, always forgive, always reach out. But your decision to let go becomes the moment they understand that love cannot survive one-sided emotional labor. For them, this realization comes slowly and painfully. At first, they might not admit it, but your silence lingers. It makes them reflect on what they lost, not because you forced them to, but because they feel the emptiness left behind. Avoidants rarely process emotions in real time. It takes space and time for them to connect the dots between their avoidance and their loneliness. Eventually, they begin to see that the distance they thought would keep them safe actually left them alone. The person who once offered warmth, patience, and understanding is no longer there to reach out to. And that awareness hits harder than they expect. Meanwhile, your silence becomes your transformation. Each day you don't reach out, you reinforce the message that your peace matters more than chasing closure. You begin to rebuild yourself piece by piece, stronger, clearer, and more self-assured. You learn that love shouldn't feel like waiting for someone to meet you halfway. It should feel like walking side by side. The avoidant may realize too late that they lost someone rare, someone who could love deeply but refused to be taken for granted. And in that realization lies the quiet power of no contact. It doesn't just free you from their control, it frees you from your old need to earn love that should have been freely given. In the end, no contact isn't about punishing anyone, it's about rediscovering your strength, your boundaries, and your worth. It's the space where clarity replaces confusion and where healing begins to take root. For the avoidant, it becomes a silent lesson about love, vulnerability, and the cost of emotional distance. And for you, it's the turning point where silence becomes power, where self-respect becomes peace, and where growth becomes your quiet victory. Thank you for listening, for showing up for yourself, and for believing that the love you give to others is the same love you deserve to receive in return.